Good. So welcome everybody. I'm Patrick Dunn. I'm a project account manager at UFI, and with me I have got four very distinguished guests. I have Nick Newman. Yes, you've got the titles on. Good. You've got Nick Newman, who's from Emerge Education. That's Europe's leading community of EdTech stakeholders. I have Kola Ayonrinde, who is from Beam. He's a data analyst. Beam is a social enterprise that uses technology and crowdfunding to support people into employment and accommodation. I have Dr. Maren Deepwell, who's the CEO of the Association for Learning Technology, which obviously is the leading professional body for learning technology in the UK. And I have Vinit Patel, who is the COO of Filtered.com. And what Filtered do, we'll hear more about this, I'm sure, is you help organizations work out what their clients need in terms of skill development using data. And we'll hear more about what each of you does and what your organization does as we go through this session. So I'll do a short intro and I'll try to keep it short because you should be much more interested in our four guests rather than me. So we're all swimming in this kind of ocean of data, aren't we? Every time we go online, we tell somebody somewhere more about ourselves. We provide them with more data. So how is this mass of data useful in designing learning technologies? What advantages does it bestow upon us to have so much data about so many people? I'm going to start by just asking, I'll start with Vinit. In your work, what are the benefits? We'll talk about ethics very shortly, but what are the benefits of having all this stuff about people in terms of helping them learn? What's the positive side? What's the promise?
Great. Getting straight into it. Oh, and I can hear myself, which is really strange because it didn't. Oh, it stopped now. Okay, all right. The powers that be have helped me out there. Okay, so Patrick, to answer your question, yeah, the promise. Why are we doing all of this in the first place? Certainly, from our organisation working with usually large enterprise businesses and their workforce of many thousands of people, there are two principal benefits. One is to the organisation, and the other is to the individual. And the theory and the thesis is that by helping the individuals at an individual level and by personalizing to their needs, that they benefit, and collectively that there is a more sort of public good in the realms of that organization, and that organization continues to innovate and develop further. I think at the end of the day, with or without data, and this is one of the challenges that learning practitioners, all of us face, whether we're in higher education or in the workplace, is that the downstream effects of what we do are very far down. It's so hard to judge this stuff. And so what you're really left with at the end of the day is your theory and your thesis, does it sort of sound about right? Can you convince enough people? And the flip side to that is you're collecting all of this stuff, all of this information, in the hope that your thesis and your premise is correct, but you don't really know, not really. And so that's where I think that's why the ethical aspect to it is so important, because it's so easy to fall into that trap and to kind of blindly follow this idea and this vision. And over time, as we see, lots of other bad stuff can accrue. So that's kind of my high level answer to being drawn the short straw there first, Patrick.
Oh, I'm sorry. Just given the nature of your work, I thought I'd go to you first. Kola, what's your angle on this? You're a data analyst. What's the promise? Why are we so enthusiastic about gathering all this data on learners?
Yeah, absolutely. So first of all, thanks for having me, and it's great to be here with the other panelists. To your question, yeah, it's really important for us specifically, but I think that for wider wider businesses, and I think we'll agree that when you can have very clear data on how something's progressing, you have a really good idea of whether they're progressing in the way that you want to or not, and how you can iterate on the process to get to where you actually want to be. Whether that's through more product analytics or through more actually looking at exactly what they've been doing in terms of the data on how they've been learning, how they've been progressing, if there's a process they need to go through, and especially when you're in a situation where hopefully they're going to get to a clear outcome, or even if the outcome is just mastery of some skill, being able to really plot towards that in a really clear North Star kind of way is really key, I believe.
Oh, great. Okay, thank you. All right, so we've heard all about the promise. We know what data analysis, there's what I call the sort of ocean of data. We know what it should do for you and your work and your learners. This session is about ethics. So now let's just look at some of those questions. I'll go to Nick on this one. In preparation to this session, you had lots to say about some of the ethical complexity here. Do you want to just give us a quick account of what your concerns are?
Sure, and I think I'll dive in with a university example actually. So one of the benefits, as you guys have touched on, of collecting data, of being able to collect data, is that you can get a single view of the student. You can begin to see when they're engaged, when they're not engaged. Now, ultimately, and there are some universities looking at this, is that there's a great outcome. Not only could you potentially spot learners who are maybe need a little bit of a nudge in terms of their learning, however, there is a correlation as well between mental health and levels of engagement at university. So, you know, an ultimate prize, you might be able to reduce something like suicide potentially even by understanding how often people are turning up to the library, how they're engaging with their lectures, where they're dropping out. So the prize there is big, not just from a learning aspect, but also from a self-care aspect. Sure. However, the minefield of integrity is, you know, how much should we be playing Big Brother? How much should we be tracking that data? Should it be the student's choice to be tracked? Is it the university's choice? You know, the ethical consideration, if you can actually potentially save or help a student, is it therefore okay to track every single one of their movement, or should that be an opt-in? Okay, and I think we're ultimately going to, you know, principle of our democracy here, which is the element of personal data freedom. And there's so much that can be understood from data now. There is a definite moral dilemma about if we can do that, and we can do so much of the data, but should it be every person's choice? And I think that is the ultimate point about any learning foundation, any education organization. Do you do it automatically when you sign up for the course, you sign up for the tool, or should there be an opt-in mechanic like you do now with advertising or tracking in certain apps, where you allow yourself a deeper level of engagement, but that becomes your own personal choice? And that's the current ethical consideration that different organizations are treading currently.
Yeah, something that struck me preparing for this session was, I have this phrase, we're not selling socks. You know, it's okay if you're in middle-sized retailer selling people, you know, trivial products and stuff. And yes, we have to consider all those considerations. We have to think about all those considerations you've just talked about, Nick, but the stakes are not high. Whereas you're talking about really high stakes here, aren't you? You know, the welfare, potentially the lives of young people, of anyone who's signing up. Maren, I noticed on your site that you actually have an ethical framework. That was a really interesting diagram. And I love Nick's phrase, a minefield of integrity. How does the Association for Learning Technology handle the minefield of integrity? I love that.
Well, it's definitely a minefield, so I can only agree. And also agree with what Vinit and Kola said. There are a lot of potential that I think many users of learning technology are, you know, only waking up to. But we've spent the last year with, you know, a group of experts from across different sectors trying to review what's already out there in terms of best practice guidance, looking at colleagues and networks we can learn from, and trying to correlate something together that could start acting as a framework that practitioners and industry can use to try and start somewhere, a common baseline to explore these questions. So in order to navigate that minefield that we're talking about. And one of the biggest current concerns that we hear a lot about is unconscious bias within the technology that's being used, particularly if particular data sets are used to train smart, you know, algorithms and machine learning in order to make these flags. So someone isn't engaging, or someone isn't present, or someone might be cheating on a test that they're being proctored and surveyed on. How do we interrogate the data sets that the technology that we want to use is being trained on, and what sort of, you know, discrimination can be built in from the outset without any intention. And I think there are a lot of things that leaders in particular are trying to get their head around. There's very technically complex to understand, and the, I think, immediate impact that we've talked about is huge. But I think there's also a further question on the long term of the data that we collect, because a lot of the sort of, changing use of technology could potentially have impact on that data further down the line. So what constitutes informed consent to opting into tools like that, I think would be a really interesting question. I'll post a link to the framework in the chat as well. It's an open framework that anyone can have a look at, and we're looking for feedback on. So I'll post that in the chat. Thanks, Patrick.
Fantastic. Thank you very much. I got a question actually from one of my colleagues at UFI. Maren has said, and you kind of touched on this, Maren. Oh my goodness, Maren and Maren. So the question is being asked by Maren, and I'll put it to Maren. This idea of this risk of early pigeonholing. So in other words, oh yeah, we've seen one of those before. We can map them into a particular data set. Right, that's what they're going to get. Is that a risk, Maren?
I think it is, and I think as the technology becomes more sophisticated, that risk changes, because Nick mentioned, for example, patterns of engagement. Well, if like in vocational education you have a very diverse group of learners, we just heard in the showcase this morning about, for example, individuals who learn part-time. They might have childcare, they might have other jobs. Their pattern of engagement will be completely different to someone who doesn't have outside commitments of learning. Or it might just be that they're particularly alive and to learning at night time. So how do you program something that will balance all these different markers and come up with a flag that then a human can interpret and act on? And if a student's flag comes up and we contact them, will it be impacting on them to kind of think, oh, okay, I'm engaging in the wrong way. I thought I was making good progress, but how is that really working? But I think for me, the concern comes at scale. So one of the things I think we have such potential with the data we're collecting is that it can help us provide personalized approaches at scale. And I think the real question is, how good is that support? How good is what the data can help us at this stage? If you're anything like me and you get recommendations from all kinds of websites, you will know that that can be very hit and miss, even at a very good commercial end, So I feel there's a lot of human scrutiny needed to make the most of the technology implementation at scale.
Oh, that's really interesting. The title of this session is, it uses the word design, and I'm very keen on that's my background, learning design. We're going to move on to that in a second. Sorry, I've just lost my chain of thought. Oh, that's right. Okay, let's move on to design anyway. So Kola, if I ask you, we've talked about the promise of data, of rich data. We're beginning to touch on some of the hurdles, some of the complexities. How does this massive data influence design, influence the thinking about what it is that you're presenting to learners, what you're making? How does it influence that?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. So as Maren said, I think that's a really key point to think about, the different types of learning that we might have in our data set. So once we want to be able to provide super personalized support, and so different groups of people. And as we start to build up more different groups of people, then we can have we can design systems which really well suit each individual person that is just wanting to use the system. And I think that really is the promise. But I think that as you definitely pointed out, there are a lot of hurdles with that process, and I think that is often in really two main areas. As a few additional ones, but the two main ones would be the data you've already collected, which might have some biases or might just not be able to generalize to the wider population. It might just be that you've not collected enough data to really do the sort of analysis you want to be doing. And secondly, the assumptions that your team bring to it, the human lens through which you build your algorithms through which you analyze data, through which you make recommendations and you start building design, that there's something there that is, you're actually putting in your own biases, your own assumptions into that, which might like sort of go through the system and end up bringing the outcome that is not super desirable. So yeah, they're the two main ones for me.
Fantastic, thanks, Nick. You put your hand up, but what's your thought on this whole design issue?
Yeah, it really makes me think, actually. As we shared beforehand, I think the whole concept of learning design is the start point, and what we've all been talking about is the collection of data. And I think the collection, and I think the mindset of how we've approached this whole issue around data is around learning analytics. And learning analytics has been a phrase that's been used for several years now. There's nothing wrong in that phrase, but the very point about that to me is at the bottom of the pyramid here, and describing analytics is the point of like viewing people as a data point. It doesn't actually talk about an outcome. It just says we want to collect data, we want analytics. And it was really interesting to hear Queen Mary University recently talk about everything that they've done in terms of moving to a hybrid mode. And they were like, it was an important mindset from a design perspective, not to talk about analytics, but to talk about learning engagement. And that shifted the entire principle of how we thought about data, how we treated data. And Mary Cook, who was in the same discussion, who's working on the current Student Futures Commission report, said yes. And there's even a next step. It's analytics to engagement to student belonging. And actually, if you think, if we're thinking about data from a student belonging perspective, it even goes beyond engagement. And suddenly you start to think about the role of data, the principles of data in a different way. And I think it helps you have a design mentality that has a different outcome for the student.
Gosh, that's striking fairly deep. Vinit, I saw you're nodding your head there. And also, perhaps bringing two things together. You and I have talked about bias before. How do we cope with the human lens? Kola mentioned this term, human lens. How do we cope with the human lens in terms of ensuring that we don't design something which starts off with an unconscious bias?
Yeah, there's so much to get into here.
I'm sure there's an easy answer.
Yeah. I mean, I just quite like the pyramid that Nick has outlined there, and I think that really brings it home. And what we've seen in serving our customers, our end users, and we are a UFI VocTech seed beneficiary from a few years ago, and it was a wonderful journey, and it was an amazing partnership. And that was just sort of pre-GDPR, right? So we were kind of growing into this. And we are one of many organizations that has had to grapple with these sorts of challenges as we have grown. One or two sort of things that we learned along the way. I think Kola's point from earlier, and to help answer this question in learning design. Much of what we do in our content recommendations to our end users, we often have that sort of cold state. To begin with, we don't have enough information on the individual, so you make a bunch of assumptions, blah blah blah. Key to how we continue to recommend and how we evaluate what we're doing is feedback. So very simple feedbacks as we go along, right? Nothing particularly fancy there, but it is critical, and that feeds into the analytics piece, and hopefully feeds up the pyramid as well. That was good, and I think most people understand that, and it's given us a bit of a compass to help us navigate through these sorts of issues. But then you have the stark reality of what actually happens in real life. And so one of our customers, a fairly large publisher, in some of our reporting, noticed that a lot of the content that was being consumed in a short space of time was around interviewing skills and finding a new job. And that started to raise sort of red flags for the internal HR team, because they thought they're on the cusp of some huge wave of, resignations and job shifts. This was a few years ago, so forget about even stuff that's been happening this year. And at that point, we had a bit of a moral dilemma internally, because the data belongs to the organization. Right, they are the data controller and blah blah blah, but it's about individuals' preferences, and one of our data principles is to allow people to have a safe space to learn, and we need to be careful in how much of that information we share to our customer and what inferences they draw from that. And so you do start to very quickly, and I think it happened to us far quicker than we were expecting, get faced with these challenges where, if you start to share either too much or it starts to get too granular, especially where the population size becomes so small that you can pretty much guess who that person is, even if you, redact a lot of the contextual information. Then you have to be basically, you just have to be extremely careful. And these are the sorts of things that we just hadn't imagined when we were designing these things. It just didn't occur to us, either because of lack of experience or ignorance, or a bunch of other things as well, I'm sure. So yeah, we've had to grow into them, and I'm not pretending like we've got an answer for that. I guess my main kind of observation is that we do our best to just constantly look out for these sorts of things as best as possible. I'm sure there are better solutions and answers to that, so I'm sort of partly here to find out for myself if others have that. But that's generally how we've gone about trying to address those sorts of things, Patrick.
I want to come to Maren in a second, but who addresses these moral issues then in your organisation? Your data people, your techies, come on.
Yeah, so who addresses them? I mean, so we have, I'll drop the link in, we have these 6 principles, and yes, there is a tension. Look, I'm not going to shy away from it. There's a tension between what our commercial teams want, frankly, which is to be able to arm our customers with the information that they want, and actually in this case, our engineers and our data science team, who generally have a much more, and I'm sure my commercial teams won't mind me saying this, a slightly more principled, or they hold these principles more strongly, right? They care about them a lot more because they're not facing up to the customers, etc. And so, yeah, in that particular example, we were able to share a high-level sort of story, but we did not go any deeper. It just didn't sit well with us.
Thank you, Maren. I want to come to you because you're a professional association, okay, for the industry. If we're stumbling, forgive me, I may be characterizing this too too messily, but if we're stumbling, we're technical people and we stumble into moral questions. How does a professional association like yours help there?
Well, I think that's exactly the problem that we've been having over the last 5-10 plus years. I mean, we've been established in 1993. The history of what kind of problems we've been having over the last nearly 3 decades is really long. So I think one of the things I really appreciate what Vinit just said was about how much the situation is evolving. And I think even if you find a good solution, a strong institutional policy to one problem, the likelihood is that the platform will have changed 6, 12, 3 days later, and you have a whole new problem, or the company's bought up and someone else then has the data. So it's a really long-term, I think, challenge for strategic leadership, particularly when it comes to digital technology. But I do think there are some really practical steps that we can take, and that's why we set up the framework. And I think firstly is to try and have some joint shared principles that you can try and adhere to and aim to. And that's what this framework that we've launched in September is designed to do. And some of the principles involved are, they sound quite practically and basic, but I think they would be very helpful. And one of them is, for example, be transparent about what data is being collected and how it's being used, and share that with all stakeholders. So that would be staff and students and everybody else involved, and try and have these conversations from the beginning, so that if you are asking students and staff to use systems either with opt-in or without it, that they're at least aware of how information is being collected and how that's intended to be used. But also, I think there is a lot of pressure, I think, particularly for education providers, to have that competitive edge. And there is a lot of sort of, oh, I don't really want to share what we're doing because it might be the USP that gets us more students, more income, more research funding, whatever it is. And that's why there's a lot less sharing when it comes across this. And one of our functions as a professional body is to provide a neutral platform for knowledge sharing. But there's, I think, some reluctance because you don't really want to admit to lots of other providers that you're really struggling with something or something's gone wrong. And that is one of the key cultural barriers I think we need to address. And that's one of the things I hope that industry can play a part in as well, because knowledge sharing between different customer bases is one of the things that will help us come up with more robust policies, but the sales and marketing teams might not be at the forefront of that particular drive.
Gosh, that's interesting. Yes, we're beginning to step into cultural issues now as well, which is fascinating. Kola, you deal with vulnerable people, don't you? The stakes are high in what you do. How do you accommodate these moral and ethical challenges in your work?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, so we deal with vulnerable people on a daily basis, really. So these are utmost importance to us, and they're at front of mind always. And like some of the others have mentioned, I think a clear way of setting this up at the start is to think about setting a cultural framework that people can all operate by, and have that set out really clearly, and that is available internally. And we also tell anybody who's our stakeholders, anybody who we're in contact with, about how we deal with that. One of those things is prioritizing safety above all else. So even if there's a time when we might have to go a little bit slower or do something in a slightly different way to or anonymize in a different way that we would normally do in order to prioritize safety, that's what we'll do. That's one of our key principles. And we have other things like that, which help us to really ensure that we're keeping the ethics really, really key and sort of at the front of what we do, because that is inevitably that is going to be the make or break of things, and that is actually the most important thing.
Yeah, thank you, Nick. It's interesting. We've heard about. I think Vinit put up the 6 principles that filtered go by. I referred to Alt's ethical framework, which I really thought was very impressive and interesting. What frameworks have you come across, Nick, in terms of trying to guide people? Because that's in a sense what we're trying to do here. We're trying to give people structures and models. I really enjoyed your pyramid, which Vinit then built on in the chat. What models and structures have you come across, and do you think these sets of principles, structures, models, do you think they help?
Yeah, I'll answer your question indirectly, because the ultimate point of your question is how you make change. Okay, how we create change. Yeah, and I guess I'd like to focus on the role of the procurement function and the role of digital strategy in enterprise. Change tends to happen once larger companies get very clear on their requirements. So if you think about ethical supply chains, if you think about diversity from a recruitment perspective, there are lots of things that happen, and the guidelines that are out there, the ones that I mentioned, are great, but they're the starting point. It's not until it becomes the fabric of large organizations that start saying to people like Filtered, here are our requirements. This is where you do you or do you not meet our data and ethics requirements? And that's the point that we have. I think over the next 3 to 4 years is going to see a considerable progress. At the moment, organizations have a digital strategy. They're talking about digital transformation, but they're focusing on the types of people they need to recruit, the types of skills they need to upskill, but they don't get that. But if you then look at their strategy, data and ethics is either missing or is a relatively incomplete section. And I'm talking about large multinationals as well as medium companies. And obviously, if you are trying to move the digital skills of 300,000 people at your multinational, it's no longer just about whether you're using filtered or Coursera or the types of things, but it's also about, hey, well, how much data are we willing to give on our employees to this organization? Where's the boundary? And if you were to ask most people, have they got a procurement guideline on this? They'd be like, no, actually, let's look at some of the frameworks. But that is currently the soft spot, I think, in progress. And once those organizations start to tighten up by using these frameworks, and they develop them internally, they put it into their digital strategy to complete their strategy, and they end up saying to companies like Filtered, here are our requirements, do you meet them or not? That's when the industry starts to tighten up. That's my perspective about the next stage of change here.
Okay, let's build on that then. I think we got about 10 minutes left. Let's build on the nature of change and the challenges of the next 10 years or so. Kola, how do we create change towards a situation where ethical handling of data and ethically driven design using data, how can we move towards a situation where, unlike in Nick's experience, this is just a routine part of thinking about learning technology? What do we do? How do we get there?
Yeah, good question. I think the things that Nick laid out are really, that feels like the path to get there. I think there are really a few key ways we would look at doing that. So that is, as Nick alluded to, being really clear for companies who are looking at this, like, these are the requirements, and like, realistically, like, do we meet them or not? Like, we're not going to compromise on these things. These are really important for us. And then people who are using these systems also to be really clear that, like, hey, we're actually, these are things that we're prepared to use, and these are things we're not. But also, I think, as you alluded to earlier, Patrick, one of the main things is really giving users a choice. So that is the customers, but in some cases there is there's a gap between who the customers are and who the users are, and people can use the product even if their company bought it for, etc., or a school or an other education provider. And it's being really clear that the users have a choice in that. I think that's something that we have started seeing in other areas. So the advertising in mobile phones is a clear example where we've started to see that users are getting a choice. And I think that principle is really the one that we need to really outline throughout all the whole experience. That, like, hey, we're going to educate users on, like, what the data is being used for, what's going on with that, and being really clear with that, and not, like, putting it in jargon that is not understandable, but being really clear, like, hey, this is the data we're collecting, this is how we're going to use it, and just giving them a choice to opt into that. And so, yeah,
that's such a good point. I'm still rather astonished on just a personal anecdotal level how little people I know understand quite how much data is being collected on them, and how it is and why it is they get hit on, for example, Facebook with exactly the right adverts for them, and they go, oh, that was a coincidence, and it's not a coincidence. So it's about well, I love it when I get cruise ship adverts, because I'm not really into cruise ships, okay, but this idea that we give users a choice as to how they're trading their data, what they're trading with, and how they use it. Giving users that choice seems a critical thing. I'm not sure where to go to next, but I have a kind of general question.
I've got an angle for you, Patrick. Yeah. I was just typing in to chat, but I'll say out aloud. It's like, yes. I really like Vinit's point about UK versus France and Germany.
Yeah.
And actually, where I think this is heading is actually the difference. If you think about the USA versus Europe, okay, and you think about at a very macro level, data privacy, the difference between the WhatsApp in America versus WhatsApp in Europe. Cultural norms are going to play a significant role. And generalizing, but if you were to end up living in America and working for an American company, I can imagine, because of their attitude to data privacy, the level of learning analytics that your company will be willing to give away will be very different to a company headquartered in France or Germany. And I can see the how we're thinking as a European culture right now about data privacy. I can see us being more conservative in how we think about the amount of data, and I can see Europe giving a lot more choice to the individual, whereas I can see other cultures, example America, actually giving a lot more of their employees data, there's not going to be a universal norm as there isn't for other things, and I can see those cultural differences. Personally, I'm really glad that we exist in a European ecosystem that seems to think more deeply about these issues, and as a result, I think it's going to end up will end up giving more choice to the user. That's how I see the future. It's being much more user based.
Sorry for being a bit naive about this, but corporates ignore national boundaries, don't they? So I've worked for a couple of corporations, and frankly, even it doesn't really matter where you are. So you mentioned the word headquarters. Is that your sort of defining characteristic? It's not where you're working; it's where your headquarters. I'm just intrigued by this.
I'm generalizing to the point of nonsense, obviously. These things, yes. But I guess I'm let's say you were a large German manufacturing company, versus a Central America manufacturing company. There's a I would say I'm suggesting that the American company will be more likely to fall in line with their nation's view on data privacy, and the German company will be more likely to fall in line with the European view on privacy. That's my point.
Yeah, sure. Yeah, I got the point, but yeah, it just intrigues me on a personal basis because I've worked in various places, and they don't care where you are. Okay, we're kind of getting roughly towards the end, so I'm going to ask a big open question. One of the themes that came up with the session yesterday, led by the RSA, was the almost impossibly fast pace of change and the fluidity in terms of the learning technology solutions that seem to pop out of the dark corners at the moment. Over the next 10-15 years, many of the established models of learning will potentially be overturned. Sorry, can you hear the pinging on my computer? Sorry about that. I don't actually know how to get rid of that. Yes, I do. I will get rid of it now. Here we go. So that's gone. Right. Yeah, how are we going to cope with change? We're coping with this enormous moral ethical challenge. How, as new technologies, as new solutions emerge, how do we address our partial understanding of them in the context of ethical moral challenges? Any thoughts, Maren?
Yeah, I happen to know the answer to this. Always in the same principle as that you need a lot of expert knowledge. And I think over the last 3 decades, we've seen a huge rate of change, and the technologies do change, but the skill sets that you need in order to make smart decisions and implement and design in the best possible way, while they are evolving, the skill sets haven't really changed. I think what we need to focus on, particularly for institutions, is to not conflate digital skills to mean absolutely everything that you need to have, but that you need to have a basic digital skills level for all your employees or all your teachers, all your learning staff, but that you do need expert roles to tackle those issues, and that you need to recognize that that's a professional skill, some of which we've discussed today, that is going to become more and more important. So that's one of the things I think in which we can cope with change, is to invest in specialized expert skills that we have as much, and then who can collaborate with industry. But also, one of the things I wanted to add to Nick's point, and that relates to our ability to cope with change, is that I think we're seeing generations of learners who are very much interested in using technology to tackle big issues that they are very passionate about, from climate change to taking anti-racism action to looking at gender inequality. And I think as well as the national and international comparisons between the different practices, I think we'll really see a lot of pushback against sort of the uniform idea of the user and, you know, the uniformity of technology, because I think those issues are going to shape more and more how new generations of learners want to engage with content online.
I'll ask the same question of you, Vinit. Thanks, by the way, Maren. Yeah, I don't think I've learned quite so much in half an hour for a long time. Vinit, change, how are we going to deal with it?
I think Maren's response was excellent. The thing that I was thinking about was, as we entered into lockdown last year, we were fortunate enough to work with the Sutton Trust, who I'm sure many of you know, and we helped them take a lot of their face-to-face programming online, you know, nothing special in that. But what was different was that where they are always oversubscribed and they only can service, you know, a few thousand people a year through their events, we could reach many thousands of people across the UK in all sorts of wonderful places, young people who would not have had many opportunities to travel over for lots of different reasons, and you know, and actually sort of students who perhaps weren't achieving as highly as some other ones, right? So we were really, you know, trying to get to as many people as possible, and we were all surprised at how resilient and open and willing young people and older people are. And I don't know if anyone watched the climate change assembly program the other night with the BBC. I think, you know, people of all ages and in different backgrounds, once they become aware of the challenge and not educated, but become aware of what the issues are, then I think everyone, you know, has an opportunity to play a part and take part, and that definitely applies to some of the stuff that you've touched on here, Patrick, but also to a lot of the bigger issues at play. So I think, you know, I think we're much more resilient than we think we are.
Oh gosh, what an optimistic note to, yeah, I almost said to finish on, but I'm going to go to Kola and ask exactly the same question. And if, you know, yeah, what are your thoughts on this? Change, coping with change, technology change, and the ethical and moral challenges that's going to present. Any thoughts on this, just to finish with?
Yeah, absolutely. And I love the answers that have been given. Already again, Maren and Vinit, really, really insightful. Yeah, I think clear. In addition to that, like, clear frameworks are really important. I think going away and taking a lot of time about thinking about that, and then implementing that and iterating on that. So we operate with quite a transparent way of going about things, and then when we, you know, if we see anything internally that we think actually, like, this doesn't fit with our framework, this is our ethical, like, principles, and, you know, this isn't quite where we thought we were, or we implemented this thing and actually maybe there was some assumption that we were making that we didn't quite notice, or maybe actually this doesn't add up in the way we thought it was going to, then we're able to be agile about that and be willing to make changes. And I think that's going to be really key. And I think, because, you know, we're not going to get everything right the first time, but being able to say that, hey, we can make a change here when it's not what we thought it was going to be, is another way of really getting towards this optimistic future that we've painted here.
Thank you, and thank you for absolutely brilliant timing, because I think we've got about 30 seconds left. So I'll thank each one of you, Vinit, Patel, Nick Newman, Maren, Deepwell, Kola, Ayonrinde. That has been fantastic, and I am going to listen to this recording again, because seriously, I've learned so much. I'm very grateful to you all. Thank you, and I hope you enjoy the rest of the showcase. Thank you very much.
Thanks for chairing, Patrick. It's a brilliant session.
Thank you, everybody.
Well done,
great to speak to you all.